In the summer of 1859, on the Beaumont plantation outside St. Martin Parish, Louisiana, the official story began with a dead white planter on a polished wooden floor. That was how men like Edward Beaumont were always introduced in the record, as victims at the moment their power ended, never as authors of the ruin that came before it. He was 38 years old when he died, wealthy by local standards, educated, married into land, the kind of man neighbors called disciplined, respectable, firm. In a slave parish, those words often meant something uglier. They meant a man who could destroy a family with a signature and still be invited to supper that same week. They meant a man who could call cruelty order, and the law would nod along. On the night of July 14, 1859, Edward Beaumont was found with his throat cut in his own house. There was no mystery about who had done it, no missing suspect, no elaborate chase through the cane fields. The man responsible was seized almost immediately. Isaiah Reed, an enslaved laborer who had been purchased only months earlier and transferred onto the Beaumont estate like livestock, listed in an account book beside mules, tools, and barrels of molasses. That fact alone should tell you what kind of world this was. A man could be bought. A man could be priced. A man could be renamed, transported, inspected, and forced into labor under the threat of the whip. Then, when that same man finally struck back, the newspapers would call it savagery, as if savagery had not already been the operating system of the plantation itself. The arrest was quick. The outrage was quicker. By sunrise, riders had already carried the news across neighboring properties. By breakfast, the phrase, "example must be made," had begun to circulate. Men who had done business with Edward Beaumont arrived wearing grave expressions and clean boots, speaking of justice with the confidence of those who had never once been mistaken for property. In their mouths, justice meant a rope. It usually did. But Edward's widow, Vivien Beaumont, did something unexpected. She refused to let them take Isaiah straight to the gallows. That decision would be remembered later as the first crack in the story, the moment when vengeance stopped moving in a straight line and became something darker, stranger, and far more dangerous. But on that morning, it looked simple. A widow demanding answers. A woman in black asking to see the man who had killed her husband. Vivien Beaumont was 29, born into comfort. Raised to obey the codes of rank, race, decorum, and silence that held Louisiana's plantation order together. She had spent years in a large house where every comfort rested on the labor of people denied even the legal right to their own children. Women like Vivien were often described as sheltered. That word is too gentle. They were not outside the system. They were protected by it, adorned by it, fed by it. They were taught not to look too closely at the machinery beneath their own lives. Yet grief has a way of stripping varnish from things. When Vivien asked to face Isaiah Reed, the men around her objected, some out of caution. Some out of pride, some because they feared what might happen if a white widow heard too much truth at once. But she insisted, and because she was still Edward Beaumont's widow, still the mistress of that house, still a Beaumont, the door was opened. Isaiah was brought before her in restraints. There are accounts that say he stood silent at first, his wrists bound, his shirt stained, his face marked by the rough handling that followed his arrest. Other accounts say he met her gaze immediately. Either way, one fact matters more than posture. He did not deny what he had done. He admitted it. Yes, he killed Edward Beaumont. But when Vivien demanded to know why, the answer did not come in the language the parish expected. There was no wild rant, no senseless confession, no performance of evil. What came instead was a chain of facts, plain, hard, humiliating facts that exposed the moral rot beneath Beaumont respectability. Isaiah told her that before arriving on the estate, he had a wife, Naomi Reed, and 2 children, Elias and Rose, not possessions, not breeding stock, not units of labor, a wife. A son, a daughter, a family. Then that family was broken apart, sold. Scattered. Converted into profit. Isaiah had begged for information. Begged for mercy, begged for the chance to buy them back piece by piece, the way enslaved men were sometimes forced to bargain for the return of their own blood. He had saved what little money he could through side work and denied himself everything that made life bearable. He brought those savings like an offering to the man who claimed mastery over him. Edward Beaumont refused. Not only refused, he mocked him for trying. That detail matters. Oppression is never satisfied with obedience alone. It wants humiliation. It wants the victim to understand that even hope is a privilege granted by the powerful and withdrawn for sport. According to Isaiah's statement, Edward destroyed the money he had saved. Whether he tore the notes, scattered the coins, or cast them aside in contempt, the message was unmistakable. Your labor belongs to me, your body belongs to me, your future belongs to me, and the people you love are gone because I say they are gone. That was the crime before the crime. The plantation South loved to document rebellion in exacting detail, but it almost never documented the daily injuries that produced it with equal honesty. It preferred the final blow to the long chain of violations that led there. It preferred the cut throat to the stolen child, the dead master to the living system that had already buried thousands in everything but name. Vivien heard the whole account, and for the first time the polished portrait of Edward Beaumont, the husband, the gentleman, the planter, began to split apart in front of her. It is easy, from a distance, to imagine that such a moment would bring instant moral clarity. It rarely does. People raised inside cruelty are experts at rearranging facts so they can keep living with themselves. Vivien did not suddenly become innocent because she listened. She had benefited from the same house, the same fields, the same labor, the same silence. She had eaten at tables set by hands that were never free to rest. She had walked through rooms cleaned by mothers who could be sold away from their children before sunset, but now the lie had become harder to hold. The man in chains was not speaking like a monster. He was speaking like a husband whose family had been dismantled for profit and pride, and the dead man on the floor downstairs was not simply a victim. He was also an architect of suffering, protected until the instant protection failed. That does not make killing righteous. It makes it legible, and that was the intolerable thing. Because once an act becomes legible, society can no longer pretend it came from nowhere. Once cause and consequence stand in the same room, dressed in human names, the language of order begins to sound like what it always was, a defense of domination. By evening, the parish still wanted Isaiah Reed dead. Nothing about his explanation changed the legal machinery waiting for him. In Louisiana, in 1859, the life of an enslaved black man weighed almost nothing against the death of a white planter. The verdict, if there was to be one at all, had already been written in custom, in terror, in property law, in the smug certainty of men who called themselves civilized while building wealth from captivity. But something had changed inside the Beaumont house. Vivien entered that room believing she was about to look upon the beast who had destroyed her life. She left carrying a more dangerous realization. Her life had already been built inside destruction. Her husband's blood was on the floor, yes, but Isaiah Reed's story revealed an older stain, one the household had learned to step around without seeing. The murder had not shattered a peaceful world, it had exposed a guilty one. And before long, Vivien Beaumont would make a decision so severe, so intimate, and so morally twisted that it would bind her forever to the man who killed Edward Beaumont, while forcing her to confront what men like her husband had truly made possible in the first place. If you're listening from anywhere in the world, comment your country and tell me, was this justice, revenge, or the inevitable result of a brutal system? By July 1859, the parish around St. Martin, Louisiana, had already decided what Isaiah Reed deserved. The decision was not complicated. It never was, when the accused was an enslaved black man and the dead body belonged to a white planter. The courthouse did not need patience. The neighboring estates did not need evidence beyond what they already believed. The ritual was familiar. Seize the man, name him savage, speak of order, and prepare the spectacle that would reassure every plantation within riding distance that the hierarchy still held. But the machinery stalled because Vivien Beaumont intervened, not out of mercy. Not yet. She did something colder. Within days of Edward Beaumont's death, she used her name, her money, and the legal reach attached to plantation property to take custody of Isaiah Reed before the public punishment could be carried out. The same society that was ready to destroy him also allowed her, as Edward's widow and heir to the estate's interests, to claim authority over what happened next. That is how warped the system was. A man could be treated as criminal and property at the same time, depending on which arrangement best served white power. The parish expected execution. Vivien chose possession. She did not free Isaiah. She did not defend him. She did not challenge the law that called him property. She simply redirected its force into her own house. She had him taken upstairs to a locked room on the second floor of the Beaumont residence, a room once used for storage and later for a sick relative. The windows were high and narrow. The shutters stayed bolted. The bedstead was stripped down to its frame. An iron ring was fixed to the wall. A chain was fastened there. That was her answer to grief. She told those around her that death would be too easy. A rope would end his fear in a single hour. A public execution would satisfy the men outside and leave her alone with silence. What she wanted, she said, was for Isaiah Reed to remain alive and know every day that he belonged to the woman whose husband he had killed. Listen carefully to what that means. The plantation order taught people like Vivien that when pain entered their lives, they had the right to answer it with ownership. Her husband was dead, so she claimed the man she blamed. Her mourning became entitlement. Her injury became a private prison. The same moral disease that had ruined Isaiah's family now took a new shape inside her. Grief did not cleanse her. It sharpened the habits the system had already planted there. So, Isaiah Reed was not led to the gallows in August 1859. He was carried deeper into the house. The Beaumont servants understood immediately that something had gone wrong in a way no one could safely name. The widow had not restored order. She had contaminated the household with unfinished vengeance. Meals were sent upstairs under instruction. Water was carried up, so were bandages once it became obvious that the wounds from his arrest had not been properly treated. No one spoke loudly in the corridor outside that locked room. No one lingered. On plantations, silence was often the first form of obedience. It was also the first accomplice. Vivien began visiting him herself. At first, the routine had all the elements of punishment. She entered only when she wished. He stood or sat when the chain allowed it. She questioned him without offering comfort. Sometimes she spoke of Edward not as a husband she loved, but as a standard Isaiah had violated by remaining alive. Sometimes she let long stretches pass without saying anything at all, as if her presence alone were meant to suffocate him. There are forms of cruelty that leave no visible mark and still degrade everything around them. This was one of them. Isaiah did not beg. That unsettled her more than rage would have. He answered when she asked direct questions. He refused when he chose. He did not perform repentance to ease her conscience. He did not plead for her pity. The man chained in her room had already crossed the line that white society declared unthinkable. He had killed the master. Once that boundary had been broken, fear no longer behaved as expected. That too disturbed the house. A captive who collapses is easier to understand. A captive who remains upright exposes the limits of domination. The chain could restrict Isaiah's body. It could not manufacture the kind of submission Vivien thought she wanted. She had taken control of his fate, but not of his mind. And that meant her revenge did not deliver the satisfaction promised by the men outside. It delivered something far more corrosive. Proximity. She was forced to see him again and again, not as a courtroom symbol, not as a body swinging from a rope for the public reassurance of white men, but as a breathing, wounded, thinking human being kept alive by her decision. This is where respectable society often lies to itself. It imagines cruelty as distance. The overseer in the field, the trader at auction, the lawmaker in the Capitol. But some of the ugliest forms of power are intimate, quiet, domestic. They happen in bedrooms, stairwells, dining rooms, and locked chambers where only a few people know what is being done. The Beaumont house in late 1859 became exactly that kind of place. Vivien ordered that Isaiah be fed properly, though not generously. She had a physician look at the damage to his wrists where the restraints had cut too deep. She insisted the room be kept clean. These acts did not make her humane. They made her methodical. A prisoner must be maintained if the punishment is meant to continue. And yet maintenance has consequences. The body that is fed begins to recover. The wounds that are cleaned begin to close. The prisoner who survives long enough stops resembling an event and starts becoming a person again in the eyes of the one who keeps him there. That is the danger of sustained captivity for the captor. Domination requires the victim to remain visible. Weeks passed. The parish gossiped. Some called Vivien unstable. Others called her strong. A few men privately admired what they saw as her firmness, because plantation society often mistook elaborate revenge for moral discipline. But many were uneasy. A white widow keeping the man who killed her husband alive under her own roof violated something deeper than custom. It broke the public script. Punishment was supposed to be swift, exemplary, and male. Vivien had made it private, prolonged, and personal. By September 1859, the Beaumont estate had become a house with two shadows inside it. Edward's death downstairs, Isaiah's captivity upstairs. The field still operated. Cotton and cane did not stop for moral crisis. Enslaved laborers still rose before dawn. Accounts still had to be kept. Orders still had to be given. This is another truth worth stating plainly. Plantation life could absorb horror and continue almost seamlessly because horror was already part of its structure. A murder shocked the parish. The daily theft of labor, marriage, safety, and childhood did not. That was considered normal. That was the real scandal. Vivien tried to resume her place in that normal. She failed. At table, Edward's chair became accusation. In the gallery, the summer air felt poisoned by the fact that a man remained chained just above the rooms where guests once drank coffee and discussed prices. In church, language about Christian duty rang thin. Louisiana society loved to speak of civilization while building it on captivity. The contradiction was not hidden. It was simply managed. Vivien could no longer manage it as easily as before. Still, she did not release Isaiah. Do not sentimentalize this stage of the story. She was not awakening into justice. She was tightening herself around contradiction. She hated him for killing Edward. She hated Edward's memory for what it had revealed. She hated the room upstairs because it forced both truths to remain alive at once. So she kept walking back into it. At times, she tried to force confession beyond what he had already said, as though repetition might produce a version she could live with more easily. At times, she accused him of destroying more than one life, and Isaiah answered with the quiet force of a man who knew his life had been under destruction long before Edward Beaumont ever bled. At times, she entered intending to speak cruelly and left having said almost nothing, because the chain on the wall began to look less like justice and more like evidence. Evidence of what exactly? Of a widow's grief, yes, but also of a system so corrupt that even its victims learned to borrow its methods. That is what the locked room really was, not an exception. A continuation. Edward Beaumont had controlled Isaiah through ownership in the field. Vivien Beaumont now controlled him through confinement in the house. The form changed. The principle remained. White injury still claimed the right to command black suffering, and yet something had begun that neither of them could fully stop. Captivity creates observation. Observation creates knowledge. Knowledge, in a house built on lies, is dangerous. Vivien had wanted Isaiah Reed close enough to punish. Instead, she had placed him close enough to haunt her. And before the year was over, the questions inside that locked room would stop being only about murder. They would turn toward a wife named Naomi, 2 lost children named Elias and Rose, and the buried truth that every plantation called order depended on family theft so constant that its defenders no longer even heard themselves confessing it. By October 1859, the arrangement inside the Beaumont house had settled into something the parish would not have understood and would not have tolerated if it had seen it clearly. Upstairs, Isaiah Reed remained chained in a locked room under the authority of Vivien Beaumont, widow of the man he had killed. Downstairs, the plantation continued to function with the same outward discipline expected of any respectable Louisiana estate. Meals were served. Accounts were balanced. Orders were given into the yard. Wagons came and went. The house presented stability. It was a lie, but plantation society had always depended on lies dressed as routine. The larger lie was the same one the South had repeated for generations, that slavery was a labor system, a paternal arrangement, a regrettable necessity, anything except what it plainly was. A machine for extracting work through fear and for destroying families whenever profit, vanity, or convenience demanded it. What happened in that locked room began to expose that truth more directly than any sermon spoken in a polite church. Vivien kept returning to Isaiah. At first, she told herself it was still part of the punishment. She said she needed facts. She said she needed to hear the story again, to test it for contradiction, to force the killer to repeat his crime until his guilt became clearer than her doubt. This is how conscience often disguises itself when it first begins to stir inside a person trained not to trust it. It borrows the language of control because control is the only language that person has been taught to speak fluently. But repetition produced the opposite of what she intended. Each time Isaiah retold the destruction of his family, the details became less abstract and more specific, and specific truth is harder to evade than general evil. General evil can be lamented from a distance. Specific evil has names, dates, places, voices, and children. His wife was Naomi Reed. His son was Elias, 6 years old when Isaiah last saw him clearly in daylight. His daughter was Rose, not yet 4, small enough to clutch at Naomi's skirt when strangers entered the yard. They had not vanished into theory. They had been separated by transaction. That is the word respectable records preferred. Transaction. Not theft, not tearing. Not moral ruin. Transaction. The South had a genius for administrative language. It could translate agony into inventory and then claim civilization because the paperwork was neat. A mother became a line item. A child became a market adjustment. A husband begging for news became insolence. This was the polished grammar of a system that wanted both profit and innocence at the same time. Isaiah described the sale in fragments over several visits in October and November 1859. He did not make it theatrical. Men who had lived under long coercion often spoke with a stripped-down precision because ornament belonged to people with room for it. He told Vivien that Naomi and the children had first been separated from him on a neighboring property before he was sold again. There had been promises that the separation was temporary. Plantation commerce thrived on that kind of lie. Temporary could mean a week, a season, a decade, or never. The point was not accuracy. The point was obedience through delayed hope. He had tried to keep track of them through whispers passed between wagons, field hands, traders, and kitchen servants, a county name here, a trader's route there. A rumor of children moved south. A rumor of a woman sent upriver. The enslaved were often forced to build their family histories the way investigators reconstruct a crime scene after the evidence has been scattered, through fragments, risk, memory, and coded trust. Vivien listened. This time she asked questions that were not about the night of July 14, 1859. What did Naomi look like? How old were the children exactly? Where had Isaiah last heard they were taken? Who handled the transfer? Which trader's name had come up most often? The questions themselves were a crack in the wall. She was no longer asking only how her husband died. She was asking how the system around her husband had lived. That was far more dangerous. A single murder could be condemned and contained. A whole social order built on domestic theft could not be examined without implicating everyone who benefited from it. Isaiah told her Naomi was strong-backed, sharp-eyed, and careful with words in front of white people because carelessness could cost a child. He said Elias liked to follow him whenever he was allowed near the workshop, touching wood shavings and asking too many questions. He said Rose was quiet until she laughed, and when she laughed, Naomi would stop whatever she was doing just to hear it fully. These were not grand speeches. They were ordinary details. That was precisely why they carried such force. Slavery depended on turning black families into categories of labor. Isaiah, by speaking plainly, kept restoring them to personhood. That did something to the room. Vivien had first entered it as a widow confronting the killer of her husband. By late autumn, she was entering it as a woman being forced to hear domestic truth from the one person her world had taught her never to regard as a moral witness. That inversion mattered. On plantations, white authority claimed the right to define reality. It named who was civilized, who was dangerous, who was trustworthy, who was naturally fitted to command, who was naturally fitted to endure. The structure survived by monopolizing the story. Now the story was slipping. Vivien began to notice things she had trained herself not to notice before. The sound of mothers in the yard calling children back too quickly when a rider passed through. The way servants fell silent when sale rumors moved across the parish. The peculiar emotional numbness that white households called order, but which was often only fear flattened into routine. Once a person sees one family clearly, the plantation stops looking like management and starts looking like organized bereavement. In November 1859, Vivien brought Isaiah a Bible. That act, in another story, might be staged as kindness. Here it was something harsher and more revealing. White Southern society loved Christian language, but it used scripture selectively. Obedience for the enslaved, comfort for the masters, very little judgment for the people who trafficked in children. The Bible had long been made to serve the plantation. Yet once placed in the hands of a man forbidden full humanity by the same society, the book became unstable again. Isaiah told her he could not read it well. That, too, was part of the crime. Literacy was treated as dangerous among the enslaved because reading opened more than books. It opened record, contract, map, law, letter, memory. A man who could read was harder to isolate completely, so ignorance was manufactured and then used as evidence of inferiority. First the system maimed the mind, then it pointed at the wound as proof of nature. Vivien began reading aloud to him. At first it was formal, almost defensive. She chose passages because the act of reading gave her an excuse to remain in the room without admitting why she wanted to remain there. Sometimes she read with the stiff rhythm of someone performing duty. Sometimes Isaiah interrupted with blunt questions that exposed how badly religious language fit the world outside the door. What kind of Christian order sold children? What kind of righteousness punished a man for resisting the theft of his own family? What kind of civilization required chains in a private bedroom to preserve itself? She had no clean answers. That was new. Plantation authority depended on confident answers, even rotten ones. Vivien had been raised among people who always had an explanation ready. Necessity, custom, property, law, race, God, order, nature. The justifications changed clothes depending on the audience, but they all served the same end. Keep the machine running. Keep conscience anesthetized. Keep the victims voiceless. Yet Isaiah's presence kept dragging abstraction back into flesh. The wall ring, the chain, the narrow bed. The scar at his wrist, the names Naomi, Elias, Rose. These details did not allow moral distance. They made the room a site of evidence, and evidence, when left in plain sight long enough, begins to accuse not just the guilty dead, but the comfortable living. By December 1859, Vivien had done something no respectable white woman of her class was expected to do. She had begun teaching an enslaved man to read, quietly, secretly, without announcement. The lessons were halting. Short words first. Names, verses, sounds matched to letters. Sometimes Isaiah's frustration showed. Sometimes hers did. Power still remained in the room, and it distorted everything. She had not ceased being his captor because she placed a book in his hands. He had not ceased being vulnerable because he answered a question correctly. Their conversations did not erase the chain. Nothing sentimental should be allowed to hide that fact, but the lesson still mattered, because every letter learned inside that room contradicted the world outside it. Every word sounded out by Isaiah Reed was a small act of recovery against a system designed to keep him legible only as labor. Every page read under Vivien's supervision also forced her to participate, however uneasily, in undoing one of the very conditions plantation life depended on. She was still trapped inside the system. She was still benefiting from it, but now she was also violating one of its unwritten commandments. Do not let the enslaved become fully knowable, even to themselves. The change did not make her good, it made her divided. And division, once it reaches a certain depth, becomes difficult to govern. By Christmas of 1859, the Beaumont house no longer held a simple arrangement of widow and prisoner. It held something much more volatile, a shared knowledge neither of them could carry without consequence. Vivien knew more about Isaiah's suffering than any white person in the parish should have cared to know. Isaiah knew that the widow who kept him chained had begun, against her own training, to hear him as a man rather than a function. That recognition was not forgiveness, not mercy, not peace. It was the first breach, and breaches inside rotten systems rarely stay small for long. Soon the woman who had chained Isaiah Reed in her upstairs room would find herself no longer interrogating only his crime, but the entire moral architecture that had produced it, while the silence between them began to fill with something neither justice nor revenge could fully explain. By the spring of 1860, the locked room in the Beaumont house had stopped functioning as a simple chamber of punishment. It was still a prison. The iron ring remained fixed in the wall. Isaiah Reed still lived under the authority of Vivien Beaumont, and every hour of his survival still depended on the decision of the woman whose husband he had killed. That fact must not be softened. Too many stories begin excusing power the moment emotion enters the frame. Power does not disappear because a captor begins to feel conflicted. It only becomes more dangerous because now domination starts borrowing the language of intimacy. And that is exactly what happened inside the Beaumont house between January and June of 1860. The lessons continued through the winter. Reading, small fragments of scripture, names, bits of newspaper. Lines copied slowly by candlelight. Vivien kept bringing books upstairs, even though every such act placed her further outside the moral script expected of a wealthy white widow in Louisiana. A woman in her position was supposed to preserve decorum, protect the estate, and mourn within recognized boundaries. She was not supposed to spend long evenings alone in a locked room with the enslaved man who had cut her husband's throat, but secrecy has its own momentum. The more private the arrangement became, the more it escaped the language of ordinary behavior. Servants noticed it without naming it. Doors opened at odd hours. Trays stayed longer than necessary. Candles burned too late upstairs. Vivien's steps on the back staircase became part of the house's nighttime rhythm. The household did what households under coercive power often do. It saw enough to understand danger, then practiced ignorance as a method of survival. That silence allowed something to grow. not innocence, not romance in any clean sense. Certainly not anything that can be defended as pure. What developed between Vivien and Isaiah was built in a room already corrupted by captivity, grief, guilt, race, and unequal power. There is no honest way to describe it without saying that every feeling inside it was contaminated from the start. Yet contamination does not make it unreal, it makes it morally unstable. And morally unstable attachments often become the most consuming of all because they are driven by forces neither side can easily confess. Vivien kept asking Isaiah about Naomi Reed, Elias, and Rose. She asked where he thought they might have been taken, which traders had passed through, which plantations were known for splitting families and reselling children farther south. The questions now lasted longer than the lessons. At times she wrote down names, at times she read old bills of sale from neighboring estates, searching for clues she never admitted she was searching for. That, too, was part of the corruption of intimacy. She had begun by chaining him to preserve her vengeance. Now she found herself preserving his memories. Isaiah noticed the change before she did. He saw it in her voice when she read aloud, saw it in the way she lingered after a question had already been answered. Saw it in the growing gap between the rigid widow the parish imagined and the woman who now sat in a narrow room listening to a man her own society insisted was less than human. He did not trust the change completely. He had no reason to. Enslaved people survived by reading white moods with precision and doubting white benevolence on principle. False softness could be as destructive as open cruelty. But he understood that something had shifted. The room no longer held only accusation. It held attention. Attention is dangerous in unequal systems because it humanizes the wrong person in the eyes of power. Plantation society allowed white people to inspect black bodies endlessly, for labor, punishment, sale, pregnancy, illness, obedience. But to attend to an enslaved person's inner life, to his memory, grief, intelligence, restraint, and wounded dignity, was to cross an invisible line. Once that line is crossed, ideology weakens. The categories begin to fail. That failure was already underway by March 1860. Vivien found herself looking at Isaiah not as a symbol of Edward's death, but as a man who had survived several forms of theft before he ever committed the act that condemned him. She noticed the scars at his wrist had faded where the chain bit less deeply now. She noticed how carefully he handled books, as though even paper had become a kind of contraband freedom. She noticed that when he spoke of Naomi, his voice changed in a way it never changed when speaking of pain directed at himself. A man may endure degradation in silence, mention his children, and the wound becomes visible. This was not a sentimental education. It was an indictment. Each detail Vivien learned made Edward Beaumont less defensible in memory. The dead husband she had once been expected to honor without question was becoming harder to separate from the system that had fed his pride, his appetite for control, and his belief that another man's family could be broken for convenience. The grave had not purified him. Death often flatters men whom life should have condemned. Vivien was beginning to understand that. That realization created a vacuum. The official story of her marriage had collapsed. The official story of Isaiah's guilt had become incomplete. Once the old moral arrangement broke apart, something else rushed in to occupy the space. Not truth alone. Desire often enters through moral fracture because desire feeds on exposure, secrecy, proximity, and forbidden recognition. By May 1860, the Louisiana heat had turned the upper floor of the house into a place of heavy air and restless nights. Windows stayed cracked when they could. The smell of wood, lamp oil, linen, and summer dampness settled into the walls. Outside, the plantation moved through its routines with mechanical indifference. Inside, the emotional pressure in that room had grown harder to deny. Vivien came upstairs one evening after sundown carrying water and a book she never opened. She had spent the day receiving a neighboring widow and 2 visiting planters who spoke with polished concern about estate management, discipline, and the rumors that abolitionists were infecting the North with dangerous ideas. Men like that could discuss stability over tea while living from the daily destabilization of enslaved families. That is one of history's filthiest habits, calling domination peace and calling resistance disorder. Something in her had hardened during that visit, or perhaps something had broken. When she entered the room, Isaiah saw at once that she had not come to teach. The book remained closed in her hand. Her grief was no longer fresh, but it had not resolved. It had curdled. Months of concealment, moral strain, physical nearness, and unspoken dependence had brought them to a threshold both had been approaching without naming. What happened next was not sudden in cause, only in action. The atmosphere between them had been changing for months, through silence, through reading, through long exchanges in which hatred no longer stood alone in the room. The chain, the bed, the late hour, the summer heat, the fact that both of them were living in forms of isolation no respectable society would ever diagnose honestly. These conditions mattered. So did power. So did race. So did captivity. No truthful telling can remove those elements and pretend what followed was simple longing. Vivien crossed the distance first. Whether it began with a touch at the wrist, a hand against his face, or a moment of hesitation too charged to survive untouched, the line was crossed in that room in late May 1860. A widow and the man she kept imprisoned became physically intimate under conditions that could not possibly be innocent. It was born from grief, domination, secrecy, guilt, loneliness, and the collapse of the moral world that had once separated them. It was not clean. It was not redeeming. It was the kind of contact produced when a corrupt system pushes two people into unbearable proximity and then leaves them there with no language fit for what they are becoming. Afterward, nothing in the house was the same. Vivien could not retreat into the role of righteous avenger. That mask had been torn away. Isaiah could not pretend the room held only punishment. The relation between them had crossed into territory so forbidden that even naming it would have threatened the social order more deeply than the murder itself. A dead planter could be explained as an outrage. A white widow secretly entangled with an enslaved black man inside her own home exposed a deeper truth. The plantation was not morally coherent. It was a structure of domination so diseased that it could rot into obsession from within. The meetings continued. Not every night, not predictably, but enough to create a secret second life beneath the visible one. By day, Vivien remained mistress of the Beaumont estate, guarded, formal, composed. By night, she returned to the upstairs room, where her control over Isaiah had become inseparable from her dependence on him. That is how corrupted power often reveals itself. It does not stop ruling. It begins needing what it rules. Isaiah did not mistake this for freedom. He understood that the chain remained, the locked door remained, her legal authority remained. Even tenderness in that room could turn cruel with a single decision, because the structure beneath it had not changed. But he also understood that Vivien was no longer intact in the way white Southern society required. She had crossed too far into contradiction. She could still command the house. She could no longer fully believe in the world that house represented, and that made her unpredictable. By June 1860, the secret had become a living thing between them, one the parish did not yet see, but one that would soon force consequences neither could contain. Because acts born in concealment rarely remain hidden when the body itself begins to bear witness. The locked room had already produced reading, confession, dependence, and forbidden intimacy. Soon it would produce evidence, and evidence once carried in a woman's body could no longer be chained to the wall and kept upstairs. By August 1860, the secret inside the Beaumont house had entered the one-stage secrecy can never fully control. It had taken root in Vivien Beaumont's body. The signs came quietly at first. Fatigue that did not lift, a tightening in the stomach, missed bleeding. A sudden recoil from food she had eaten all her life without notice. In another household, under another moral order, such signs might have been greeted with celebration. On a Louisiana plantation built on racial hierarchy, widowhood, and surveillance, they meant danger, not private danger, systemic danger. Because if Vivien was carrying Isaiah Reed's child, then the upstairs room no longer held only a hidden relationship. It held proof. Proof that the categories the plantation depended on, mistress and captive, white widow and enslaved man, ruler and ruled, purity and contamination, had already collapsed in practice inside one of its own most respectable houses. The South preached boundaries it violated constantly. That is one of the filthiest truths beneath its public morality. White men crossed those boundaries with impunity for generations and called it appetite, weakness, custom, even silence. But when a white woman crossed toward a black man, especially one in bondage, the act became socially explosive because it threatened not only respectability, but the myth of white control itself. It revealed that the system was not natural order. It was fear fortified into law. Vivien understood that before she spoke a word. By the second week of August 1860, she had summoned a physician quietly, under the pretext of persistent weakness. Men like him served plantations by treating illness while averting their eyes from the larger disease. He examined her with the discretion expected among elite families, asked the necessary questions, and gave the answer in soft professional language. She was with child. He likely assumed the father was dead, Edward Beaumont, and if he suspected otherwise, suspicion did not become statement. Southern society functioned partly through strategic blindness. Men in respectable coats survived by not naming what could bring a household down unless naming it served the interests of power. Still, whatever the doctor guessed, Vivien heard only one fact. The child could not be Edward's. Edward Beaumont had been dead for more than a year. The arithmetic was merciless. That evening she went upstairs. Isaiah saw the truth in her face before she spoke. She had the look of someone who had reached the end of denial and found not relief but reckoning. She told him plainly. She was pregnant. The child was his. What followed was not joy, not the sentimental astonishment weak storytellers sometimes force into broken histories because they cannot tolerate moral complexity. What followed was silence. Long, hard silence, the kind that falls when two people understand that the future has just narrowed and widened at the same time. Vivien spoke first about escape, not the dramatic kind, not torches in the night or fantasies of disappearing into swamp country without supplies or contacts. She spoke in the language available to someone of her class: liquidation, sale, transfer, movement north, distance from the parish, a new house in a city where fewer people knew their names. She said she could sell the plantation. She said she could leave St. Martin Parish before suspicion hardened into accusation. She said she could free him. More than that, she said she would help find Naomi Reed, Elias, and Rose if there was still any trail left to follow. Listen to the terms carefully. This was not simply confession. It was the first time Vivien tried to act against the structure that had formed her. That does not make her innocent. It means that guilt, once matured into consequence, had finally begun pushing her toward repair. Weak souls often mistake feeling bad for doing right. The two are not the same. For months, Vivien had suffered contradiction. Now contradiction had become obligation. Isaiah did not answer the way she wanted. He did not seize the fantasy of a hidden life together. He did not speak as if a child could wash blood out of history. He knew too much for that. He reminded her what stood between them. Edward Beaumont's death, the chain on the wall, the months of captivity, the stolen years of his first family, the fact that Naomi still existed somewhere in the world if she was alive at all, a man whose wife had been sold and whose children had been scattered, does not become cleanly available because a white widow has reached moral crisis. Isaiah refused to let her turn necessity into romance. That refusal mattered. It was one of the few places left in the story where clear moral resistance still held. He told her the child was innocent. He did not say the same about the future. By September 1860, Vivien had begun taking concrete steps. Plantation records show that neighboring estates were under pressure from falling prices, political unrest, and the gathering national crisis over slavery's expansion. Men were arguing over the election of 1860 as though the nation's soul had only just become endangered, when in truth that soul had long ago been mortgaged in auction yards and cotton ledgers. Vivien used the moment to justify changes in estate management. She dismissed some staff, consolidated accounts, opened correspondence beyond the parish, quietly contacted intermediaries who could help locate people sold through regional traders. This is where the story stops being only about forbidden intimacy and begins confronting restitution. Restitution is never clean. It does not reverse the theft. It does not restore time. It does not resurrect innocence in the guilty or erase scars in the wounded. At best, it is an admission written in action. This wrong was real, and I can no longer live by pretending otherwise. Vivien searched for Elias and Rose first because children left the clearest transactional traces. They were often listed separately in bills of sale, insurance notes, plantation inventories, or transfer disputes. Mothers were harder to follow. Women disappeared into domestic service, field gangs, sexual exploitation, or resale routes where their names were altered or reduced. The record was meticulous when profit required it and conveniently vague when accountability threatened. Through agents and purchased information, Vivien learned that 2 children matching the ages and descriptions Isaiah had given had been sold west, then resold within Louisiana. By October 1860, she had reason to believe both were still alive. Naomi, however, had vanished into rumor. One account placed her on a property near the Red River. Another said she had fled during a transport. A third claimed she had been sold out of state under another name. The uncertainty itself was part of slavery's violence. Families were not merely broken. They were made untraceable. When Vivien brought this news upstairs, Isaiah's reaction was measured but not cold. Hope had become dangerous to him long before he entered the Beaumont house. Men in bondage learned to distrust every promise because promises were one of the tools used to manage them. Still, the mention of Elias and Rose changed something in his face. The possibility that his children still lived within reach of rescue gave shape to a future larger than the room. It also made another truth unavoidable. If he was to leave with his children, what was Vivien asking to become? A benefactor? A fugitive companion? The mother of his child? A second family built on the remains of the first? The proposition was morally impossible, and Isaiah knew it before she fully did. By November 1860, with Abraham Lincoln's election driving Southern panic into open rage, Louisiana planters spoke of honor, sovereignty, and threat. Notice how often societies built on domination suddenly discover the language of victimhood when their power is challenged. Men who had profited from chained labor for decades now spoke as if they themselves stood under assault because the political weather had shifted against them. Hypocrisy was not a side effect of the slave order, it was one of its main instruments. In that atmosphere, Vivien's position became even more precarious. A pregnant widow on an unstable estate could not withstand prolonged scrutiny. She accelerated her plans. Arrangements were made to sell portions of Beaumont land and move assets through trusted channels. Publicly, she could claim health concerns and family reorganization. Privately, she was preparing to dismantle the world that had produced both Edward Beaumont and the room upstairs. Then the final break came. Vivien told Isaiah she was ready to leave the plantation behind and asked in plain terms whether he would come with her once Elias and Rose were secured. He refused, not because he felt nothing. That would be too easy. He refused because he still belonged, morally and emotionally, to a history Vivien could not absorb into herself. Naomi Reed was not dead in his heart. The children he wanted back were children of that first life, not instruments for building a second one around secrecy and contradiction. He would not let the suffering of his family be overwritten by the comfort of a new arrangement, however sincere Vivien's desperation might now be. In a story full of corrupted lines, this was one of the few acts that restored order to the conscience. A child would be born. That could not be undone. But Isaiah would not pretend that blood and tenderness had solved what slavery had destroyed. By the winter of 1860, the Beaumont house stood on the edge of collapse from several directions at once. National crisis, estate decline, pregnancy, secrecy, and the still unfinished search for Isaiah's family. The locked room had produced its final lesson. Desire had not abolished history. Guilt had not become absolution. Love, if that word could even survive in such conditions, was no defense against the dead, the stolen, and the first obligations a man still owed to those torn from him long before Vivien Beaumont ever climbed the stairs. What remained now was decision. Not feeling, not confession, decision. And in the months ahead, Vivien would be forced to do the one thing her class almost never did willingly. Spend her fortune, her status, and the wreckage of her old life trying to return what the plantation had stolen, while preparing to lose Isaiah Reed precisely because she had finally begun to understand what had been taken from him in the first place. By January 1861, the Beaumont plantation was no longer a stable estate. It was a decaying structure held together by paperwork, fear, and a lie that could not survive much longer. The national crisis was accelerating. South Carolina had already seceded in December 1860. Across the Deep South, planters and politicians suddenly spoke as if civilization itself were under attack. What they meant, stripped of rhetoric, was simpler. They feared losing a system that had made them wealthy through forced labor and family theft. They called that fear honor. They called it rights. They called it defense. History should call it panic from men who sensed that their moral accounting was coming due. Inside that atmosphere, Vivien Beaumont moved quickly. She had no more room for hesitation. She was carrying Isaiah Reed's child. She could not remain indefinitely in St. Martin Parish without attracting the kind of scrutiny that ruins women and destroys black men. More importantly, she had already crossed from awareness into obligation. She knew what had been done to Isaiah's family. She knew what Edward Beaumont had been. She knew the locked room upstairs had become evidence not only of her private corruption, but of the entire plantation order's rot. The question was no longer whether she would act. The question was whether action could still recover anything worth saving. She began with the children. In February 1861, through intermediaries, purchase agents, and information bought from traders who never minded taking one more payment from the wreckage they helped create, Vivien confirmed that Elias Reed and Rose Reed were alive. Elias, now around 8, had been transferred through 2 properties and was working in yard labor beyond what any child should have borne. Rose, younger, had been kept in domestic quarters on another estate, listed in records not as a daughter, not as a human being with memory, but as a girl, sound, suitable for house use. That language should never be repeated without judgment. This is how slavery disguised desecration as commerce. It flattened children into condition reports. It turned endurance into marketability. It trained buyers to speak of human beings the way they spoke of tools, horses, timber, and soil quality. Then, once the paperwork was complete, it expected society to continue discussing morality as if no crime had occurred. Vivien paid what was demanded, not because the prices were just. They were obscene. To buy back stolen children is not redemption. It is extortion by a criminal order, but within that order, money was one of the few weapons the guilty could use against the machinery they had inherited and served. She used Beaumont funds, liquidated assets, and sold portions of land that had once announced family prestige. Piece by piece, the estate that had helped cage Isaiah Reed was dismantled to retrieve the children it had no right to separate in the first place. By March 1861, Elias and Rose had been brought under her control. The reunion with Isaiah did not happen in public. It could not. The house itself was too compromised, too watched, too full of servants forced into silence. But somewhere within the shrinking Beaumont property, father and children saw one another again after years shaped by sale, rumor, and disappearance. No respectable record would preserve that moment honestly. Plantations documented transactions far better than reunions. Yet some truths do not require theatrical language. A father saw his son. A father saw his daughter. Children taken by force recognized the man who had been made powerless to protect them. The system had not intended that scene to happen. That alone condemns it. Naomi Reed was another matter. Vivien kept searching through the spring of 1861. The reports remained contradictory. One source claimed Naomi had been transported toward Texas. Another suggested she had escaped during a transfer convoy months earlier. A third insisted she had died of fever under another owner's watch. None could be confirmed. That uncertainty was not a footnote. It was one of slavery's signature injuries. It did not merely separate families. It forced them to live inside permanent doubt, no burial. No verified sighting. No final word. Just the endless violence of not knowing whether someone you loved was dead, captive, or searching for you somewhere under another name. Isaiah understood what that meant. So did Vivien, finally. This is the point where lesser stories try to cleanse everyone with noble sacrifice. But history does not wash so easily. Vivien's efforts did not erase the months she had kept Isaiah chained. They did not erase the fact that she had acted only after grief, guilt, desire, and pregnancy forced her past the point of comfort. Her awakening came late and cost her less than the enslaved had been paying all along. Still, late action is not the same as no action. Moral clarity delayed remains morally inferior to clarity on time, but it can still matter if it becomes costly enough to alter the lives of others. By April 1861, the war had begun. When Fort Sumter fell on April 13, 1861, the South entered open rebellion in defense of slavery, even if many men preferred more polished language. Louisiana moved deeper into the cause. In that climate, Isaiah's continued presence near the Beaumont house became impossible. A black man tied to the murder of a white planter, now secretly freed and reunited with children once sold away, would not survive prolonged exposure to public attention. The atmosphere was too charged, the ideology too brittle, the appetite for exemplary punishment too familiar. Vivien made the only decision left. She freed him. Not symbolically, not in the language of household favor. She arranged papers, protection, transport, and money. She took the risk of moving Isaiah, Elias, and Rose away from the parish under cover of estate transition and wartime confusion. Some details were likely hidden, even from those who helped. That was necessary. In slave country, the law itself could function as a hunting dog. Too many eyes on a movement meant capture, or worse, a return disguised as legal correction. The journey northward in late spring 1861 was not triumphant. It was tense, fragmented, and vulnerable. Roads were watched. River crossings could expose papers as quickly as they could conceal them. Every mile carried the risk that white authority would reassert itself and declare all promises void. Vivien accompanied them through part of that passage, not as a liberator untouched by the past, but as a woman who now had to spend her body, name, and remaining privilege in direct conflict with the social order that had once protected her. That matters. Because redemption, where it exists at all, is not a feeling, it is a cost. At some point on that route, whether near the Mississippi crossings, in the confusion around border traffic, or through abolitionist assistance farther north, Vivien and Isaiah parted. There was no clean future for them together. He had made that plain months earlier, and he had been right. Their bond had been real, but reality is not innocence. A child connected them. History separated them. Between them stood Edward Beaumont's death, Naomi's absence, the locked room, the plantation, and the original wound that had started everything, a family broken for profit. No amount of private attachment could build a moral house on that foundation without cracking under the weight of what had come before. Isaiah left with Elias and Rose. Vivien remained behind with the unborn child. That separation was not sentimental tragedy, it was judgment. By early 1862, Vivien had resettled in Chicago, far from the Louisiana plantation world that had formed and corrupted her. There, she gave birth to a daughter, Clara Beaumont. The child entered the world carrying several inheritances at once: white privilege through her mother, black lineage through her father, and the burden of a story born from coercion, blood, secrecy, and late moral reckoning. None of that was the child's fault. Children are always handed the debris of systems they did not build. The measure of adults lies in whether they pass on silence or truth. Vivien did not return south to reclaim the old order. Instead, through 1862 and 1863, she drifted toward anti-slavery circles, war relief networks, and the rough moral labor of trying to oppose the very world that had fed her comfort. That should not be romanticized either. Many former beneficiaries of slavery joined good causes only after history made neutrality inconvenient. Yet even compromised conviction can save lives when money, access, and risk are finally placed on the right side. Isaiah, meanwhile, moved farther north. By fragmented reports reaching through letters and intermediaries, he eventually made his way with Elias and Rose into Canada, where many formerly enslaved people sought the first unstable version of legal safety they had ever known. There, against long odds, he found what Louisiana had nearly destroyed completely. Time to rebuild fatherhood. Then, in the deepest turn of the story, Naomi Reed reappeared alive. Whether through escape, transport, and separate networks of flight, she too had survived. Their reunion was not the kind fiction likes to decorate. Years had passed, scars had accumulated, trust had to be relearned under the shadow of everything done to them. But they were alive. And under slavery, survival itself had always been a form of testimony against the system meant to consume them. So by the middle years of the war, the lines were drawn clearly. The Beaumont plantation was finished as a moral world even before the Confederacy itself would collapse. Vivien Beaumont, once mistress of that estate, was now a mother in the North living with the evidence of her own contradiction and trying, too late but not entirely uselessly, to turn privilege into repair. Isaiah Reed, once chained in her upstairs room, was now a father reclaiming his children and, against history's expectations, restoring contact with the wife the slave market had tried to erase from his life. The system had not been defeated by kindness, it had been exposed by what it could not stop producing. Widows made guilty, children sold twice over, families scattered across state lines, secret pregnancies, false Christian respectability, and men who called themselves civilized while treating reunion as a financial transaction. The war would go on. More graves would follow. More proclamations, battles, and speeches would enter the record. But the deeper judgment had already been written. A plantation widow had to dismantle her own house to recover fragments of the family that house helped destroy. And the man once caged inside it walked away, not with vengeance fulfilled, but with the harder task history almost never offers the broken: the chance to live on, gather what remained, and decide what kind of truth his children would inherit. By 1872, the war was over. Slavery had been abolished on paper, and the United States had already begun its familiar betrayal. Men who had once defended bondage in broad daylight were now adjusting their language, laundering their reputations, and pretending the nation's crime had ended the moment the law changed. It had not. Systems do not disappear because statutes do. They retreat into memory, money, inheritance, and silence. The auction block may be gone, but the damage it produced keeps walking through the lives of the children born beneath it. No one understood that more clearly than Vivien Beaumont. She was living in Chicago now, far from St. Martin Parish, far from the Beaumont plantation, far from the locked room that had ruined whatever remained of her old moral innocence. Her daughter, Clara Beaumont, was no longer an infant. She was growing into a sharp-eyed young girl with questions that could not be delayed forever. Children notice silence long before adults admit it exists. Clara knew there was no father in the house. She knew her mother's answers were measured too carefully. She knew certain names were never spoken casually. She knew letters arrived some years and not others, and that when they did, Vivien read them alone first. The child had been born from secrecy, but secrecy is a poor architect. It cannot build a stable home. It only delays collapse. Vivien had spent the late 1860s trying to construct a life that looked respectable from the outside. She supported abolitionist charities, contributed to war widows' funds, and assisted networks helping displaced black families find work and shelter in northern cities. There was sincerity in some of it. There was guilt in all of it. She had long since learned that good works do not erase the structure that made them necessary. They can only stand as payment toward a debt that remains larger than the person trying to repay it. Meanwhile, far to the north, Isaiah Reed had rebuilt something that once seemed impossible. In Ontario, Canada, he had reunited with Naomi Reed, and together they raised Elias and Rose through the difficult years after escape, war, and dislocation. Reunited families are often spoken of as if reunion itself solves the wound. It does not. It only creates the hard privilege of facing the wound together. Naomi returned to a husband altered by grief, captivity, and time. Isaiah returned to a wife who had survived her own unrecorded ordeals under a system designed to erase women like her except when pricing them. Elias and Rose returned not to the childhood that was stolen from them, but to the long labor of becoming whole with the fragments left behind. This is what slavery's defenders never counted honestly, not only the people they broke, but the years required to live afterward. For a time, the connection between Chicago and Canada remained indirect, cautious, and mostly written. Vivien and Isaiah exchanged letters through intermediaries who knew enough to keep names protected when necessary. The letters were restrained. They had to be. There are some histories language cannot carry without cracking, but through them, facts passed from one life into another. Clara was healthy, Elias had grown tall, Rose was learning quickly. Naomi remained wary of any mention of Vivien, and rightly so. Isaiah did not ask for friendship. Vivien did not ask for absolution. That restraint was the only honorable thing available to them. Then time did what time always does to buried truths. It made them heavier. By 1878, Clara was old enough to understand that the story of her birth had been hidden from her, not the biology alone, the whole architecture of it, the Louisiana plantation. Edward Beaumont, Isaiah Reed, the murder, the captivity, the child born after all of it. Vivien had postponed the telling because adults often call delay protection when what they really mean is fear. But every year of silence made the eventual revelation harder, not kinder. So she told her, not every detail at once, perhaps. No mother begins by handing a child the full inventory of corruption from which she emerged. But the central truth was spoken. Clara's father was alive. He was a black man named Isaiah Reed. He had once been enslaved. He had killed Edward Beaumont, the white planter whose name Clara carried. And Vivien herself had been bound to him by a history too dark to describe as ordinary love and too human to reduce to a crime report. Clara's first reaction was not shame. It was hunger. She wanted to know him. That desire should not be underestimated. Children born from buried histories often carry a fierce instinct toward truth because truth is the only inheritance that can resist poison. Clara did not ask to be born from contradiction, but once she learned she had been, she refused to live on half a name. Vivien resisted at first. Then she relented. By 1880, arrangements were made for a meeting. It did not happen carelessly. Too much stood behind it. Too many people had earned the right to refuse, Naomi Reed especially. No honest version of this story can push past her pain. While Vivien had suffered guilt and loss, Naomi had suffered dispossession in its rawest form, sale, separation, disappearance, uncertainty, and the knowledge that while she was being hunted by the machinery of slavery, another woman had conceived a child with her husband inside the wreckage of that same machinery. Whatever sympathy one extends to Vivien must never be allowed to crowd Naomi out of the moral center. Naomi had the clearest claim to anger, and anger was not only justified in her case, it was evidence of memory functioning properly. Still, the meeting went forward. When Clara first saw Isaiah Reed, she was not looking at a myth. She was looking at a man aged by labor, war years, displacement, and survival. A father who had lived long enough to become almost impossible under the terms of the old plantation world, not dead in a ditch, not vanished in a ledger, not reduced to rumor. Alive, that alone carried force. Isaiah saw in Clara certain traces of Vivien, but also something else history rarely permits itself to admit. The child was not a symbol of corruption alone. She was a person. Slavery had made her origins scandalous. Time had made her human in full view. Their meeting could not erase anything. It could only confront what remained. Clara asked questions with the directness of someone who had grown up among too many careful sentences. She wanted to know about his life, about Naomi, about Elias and Rose, about Louisiana, about the truth of Edward Beaumont, about why he had not come for her. Some questions had answers, others had only grief. Isaiah did not lie to make the past gentler. That was one dignity he could still offer his daughter, honesty without decoration. In the months that followed, the circle widened. Clara met Naomi. That encounter mattered more than any reunion with Isaiah alone. Because Naomi represented the truth, no one else could soften. The first family, the first injury, the woman whom the market tried to erase so that everyone else could rearrange the story around themselves. Naomi did not welcome Clara with easy warmth. That would have been false, and false mercy is only another form of disrespect. She received her cautiously, looked at her long, and made clear in word and bearing that the child was innocent, but the history was not. That distinction saved the meeting from sentimentality. It also allowed something real to begin. Elias Reed and Rose Reed, now adults, met Clara not as an intruder exactly, but as a late consequence of a world that had damaged all of them in different ways. She was their half-sister, yes, but she was also the visible proof that slavery had not only sold families apart, it had also forced human bonds into forms that violated every natural expectation and then left the children to make sense of the wreckage. No sermon from a politician could explain that away. No monument to Southern honor could cleanse it. Over time, fragile acceptance took shape. Not forgiveness in the shallow sense, not harmony, something narrower, truer, and more difficult. Clara was allowed to belong without being allowed to rewrite what belonging had cost. Naomi never pretended Vivien had been harmless. Vivien never demanded a place she had not earned. Isaiah remained the bridge and the wound at once, the one person tied to all sides of the story by blood, crime, memory, and survival. Later, when Clara married Samuel Carter in the mid-1880s, the family history did not vanish into respectability. It traveled forward. That is how legacy works, not as a polished version of the past, but as a burden passed into new hands with the hope that the next generation will tell the truth more plainly than the last. And that, in the end, is the deepest judgment in this story. Edward Beaumont began as the kind of man the slave South called respectable. He died as the product of a system he believed he controlled. Vivien Beaumont began as a beneficiary of that system, then spent the rest of her life trying, never fully enough, but not meaninglessly either, to repay a moral debt she had inherited and intensified. Isaiah Reed began as property in the eyes of the law and ended as the one figure the system failed to erase, a husband, a father, a witness, and the living contradiction of every ledger that tried to reduce him. Naomi Reed endured the market's full contempt and remained morally unbroken enough to confront the past without surrendering truth for comfort. And Clara Beaumont, born from secrecy and imbalance, became the final proof that the innocent often carry the loudest evidence of adult wrongdoing. The plantation was gone. The stain was not. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and comment with your location. And tell me this, was Vivien Beaumont seeking redemption or only trying to survive the truth too late? Your theory may reveal more about history than the records ever did.